Everyone knows that young people live in the here and now. No matter what's going on around them, they pay attention only to the present. In reality, though, these juveniles represent the future. They will be America's leaders, decision makers, workers, and parents. Guiding their transition from childhood to adulthood is our responsibility. The way we treat our juveniles determines what will become of our society. For this reason, juveniles who refuse to accept society's values, those who chronically misbehave or break the law, represent a crucial challenge. What is the best way to handle delinquent juveniles? Should we punish them and hope that fear of further punishment will persuade them to conform? Or should we give them the help, care, and treatment they need to become healthy, law-abiding adults? As it has throughout history, this fundamental question lies at the heart of juvenile justice in the United States. Today, we tend to think of childhood as a time of innocence. The media have shown us cute, good-natured, occasionally mischievous children who need only the gentle guidance of supportive parents. This, however, is a relatively new image of childhood. Through much of history, juveniles were considered inherently wicked creatures who needed to have morality beaten into them. In medieval Europe, all law came from the church. Anyone who went against the church's decrees, no matter what his or her age, would be severely punished. Juveniles were hanged, drowned, or burned at the stake, just as adults were. By the 16th century, imprisonment had begun to replace beating and execution as the punishment for lesser crimes. In prison, juveniles received no special treatment. Adults and juveniles were often required to share the same cell. In the 17th century, English colonists began to come to America. They brought with them the same beliefs that had guided them in England. Strong religious convictions, an unwavering faith in church teachings, and a reliance on physical punishment as a way of reinforcing those teachings. For juveniles, this punishment was usually handled within the family. If the family failed to control a juvenile, the community would prescribe its own punishments. For the most severe kinds of misbehavior, a juvenile could be banished or executed.
We basically thought of our children as pests. We didn't truly understand the value that children have to us. In England, the number of street children continued to increase. Why? Basically, more children were being born than society could properly handle. In our own culture today, as we go down the street, we notice street people. We don't like to see street people, either did the Europeans of years ago. As these Europeans immigrated to the United States, they brought this philosophy and problem with them.
Beginning in the late 18th century, the Industrial Revolution and waves of immigration brought increasing numbers of people to American cities. Those who couldn't find work were reduced to extreme poverty. Though many people were concerned by the crimes and violence committed by unsupervised juveniles, other people became concerned about the welfare of the juveniles themselves. A number of philanthropists and social reformers, such as prison administrator Zebulon R. Brockway, began to work for improved care and treatment of juveniles. These juvenile advocates pressed for legislation that would take neglected children off the street and place them under public care. Through the efforts of the juvenile advocates, the New York City House of Refuge, the first juvenile institution, was opened in 1825. Similar facilities sprang up around the country over the next few decades. For the first time, neglected and delinquent juveniles were housed separately from adults. Other than that, however, these new institutions were hardly revolutionary. Houses of refuge were, for the most part, houses of punishment. Juveniles were often fettered, whipped, or placed in solitary confinement. Most of their time was spent at forced labor because work was considered to build character, but also because juvenile labor helped the houses of refuge turn a profit. Charles Loring Brace was an active juvenile advocate who founded the Children's Aid Society in 1853. He believed that the repressive environments of the houses of refuge corrupted juveniles instead of helping them. Brace and others like him insisted that juveniles were basically good and that they could be helped if they were put in the proper environment. To prove his point, Brace initiated a program of placing out, removing juveniles from institutions and placing them with families settling the western frontier. In reality, placing out turned out to be little more than an organized system of slave labor. Juveniles were forced to do back-breaking farm work and received little or nothing in return.
We transferred thousands of children from New York City west. These now famous train rides helped settle the western states. We passed children out to western settlers, mainly the pioneers, to help work on the farms.
As placing out grew in popularity, the eastern states began to worry that the West was taking away their cheap juvenile labor force. They began to make changes in the way they handled delinquent and neglected juveniles. In 1847, the Lyman School for Boys opened in Westborough, Massachusetts. This was the first of many state-run reform schools. Reform schools, unlike the houses of refuge, concentrated on training. They were intended to teach juveniles the values and skills they would need to survive in the adult world. Despite their good intentions, reform schools were often crowded and inhumane. They reflected society's continuing belief that juveniles themselves were at least partly to blame for their own misfortunes.
During the 1880s and 1890s, we began to see large institutions for juveniles. It was not uncommon to find institutions with 500, 600, 700, even 1,000 or more kids in them. Why? Well, there was a great number of unattached children, children with no family, children that were not a part of society. You see, we always had trouble knowing what to do with these children.
A new era began in 1899 when Cook County, Illinois established the first juvenile court. For the first time, delinquent juveniles were removed from the jurisdiction of the criminal court and given a court system of their own. The philosophy of the juvenile court was that the government must protect and discipline the juveniles under its jurisdiction when families fail to do so. This legal doctrine is known as parens patriae, the government as substitute parent. This was more than just a technical change. It signified a whole new way of thinking about juvenile justice. A juvenile who committed an offense would no longer be regarded as a criminal, but as a child in trouble.
Juveniles have basically been a problem for most societies. Adults seem to have a difficult time knowing how to treat juveniles as they merge into adolescence. When to treat them as a child and when to treat them as an adult becomes a very, very difficult problem for most adults in society in general. But by and large, kids, juveniles, have a certain quality that differentiates them from adults, and this quality has little or nothing to do with the kind of offense. We have many, many juveniles who basically have a desperate need to succeed at something and to learn something. They, unlike some of their more calloused adult partners, have hope that even though things are going bad now, some magic will occur and things will go better for them in the future. Historically, this is always what has been the difference between a juvenile and adult offenders, and as a result it gives people in juvenile justice an opportunity to develop programs which take note of the primary basic optimism of juveniles as compared to adults.
The focus of the new system was on treatment rather than punishment. Other states quickly followed Illinois' lead and adopted treatment-oriented, non-adversarial juvenile court systems. In these new juvenile courts, a juvenile was never required to stand trial. Instead, the juvenile was given an informal hearing, often in the judge's chambers. There was no prosecutor and no jury. The usual participants were the judge, the juvenile's parents, probation officers, and social workers. After reviewing the juvenile's history and listening to the recommendations of the social workers, the judge, under the doctrine of parens patriae, would decide what was best for the juvenile. Juveniles were sent to juvenile court for many different reasons. Some were accused of breaking criminal laws. for example, committing robbery or assault. Others were accused of committing status offenses, that is, breaking laws that apply only to juveniles. Truancy and running away from home are examples of status offenses. Still others were accused of no offense at all. They were simply unsupervised juveniles in need of state protection. Many were orphans, and some came from families that were too poor to care for them. To underline the broad differences between juvenile justice and criminal justice, the juvenile courts introduced a new vocabulary that is still in use today. Juveniles aren't arrested. Instead, they are taken into custody. Juveniles in need of secure custody aren't kept in jail, but in a juvenile detention facility. A juvenile who has broken the law is never convicted or sentenced. Instead, the juvenile is adjudicated delinquent and committed for custody and treatment. Treatment in the early days usually meant a state-run juvenile institution or private treatment facility. Many of the private institutions were established with the help of religious groups, and their chief purpose was to train juveniles in morality, character, and religion. Later, juvenile institutions began to place more of an emphasis on vocational training, followed by an emphasis on academic education. In the years following World War II, these institutions began to offer psychological counseling as well. This 1938 film footage offers a rare glimpse into daily life at the girls' industrial school in Beloit, Kansas. Like other juvenile institutions of its time, it offered academic instruction, vocational training, religious services, recreation and leisure activities, meals, and dormitory-style housing. Of course, institutionalization was not the only treatment option. From the very beginning, the juvenile court system has offered probation as an alternative. Probation, before institutional commitment, and aftercare, after institutional commitment, offer juveniles the chance to live a normal life in the community, so long as they follow certain rules and meet regularly with caseworkers. From its beginning in 1899, the juvenile court system was very successful. Within 50 years, every state and the federal government had established juvenile courts of their own. The system was thought to be so effective at dealing with troubled juveniles that it remained relatively unchanged until the 1960s. The 60s were a time of optimism, activism, and social change. Inspired by such leaders as Martin Luther King Jr., the civil rights movement was winning unprecedented power for African Americans. The feeling of newfound freedom spread throughout the nation, as young Americans began to fight back against a government and a culture they felt was oppressive. This period had profound effects on law enforcement, the criminal justice system, and the juvenile justice system.
In the 60s, the whole country was going through a stage of accountability. This is when if you remember your history, when you have all the riots going on in the nation, turmoil, and everybody had to account for everything that was going on. And so the corrections field, both adult and juvenile, had to also professionalize more. They had to be held accountable. And so things started to change very drastically.
On June 8, 1964, a woman living near Phoenix, Arizona, reported to the police that she had received an obscene phone call. She told the police that her neighbor, a 15-year-old boy named Gerald Galt, had placed the call. The police took Gerald into custody without telling him anything about the crime he had been accused of. Because the juvenile court was designed to be non-adversarial, it offered none of the constitutional safeguards that an adult would have had in criminal court. Gerald had no right to a lawyer, no right to question his neighbor about her accusations, and no right to remain silent. Instead, Gerald and his mother met with a judge and 2 probation officers and discussed the matter informally. Based on what the officers said had happened, the judge held that Gerald was delinquent. The judge ordered that Gerald be committed to the state industrial school until he was 21. If Gerald had been an adult, the maximum penalty for making an obscene phone call would have been a $50 fine or 2 months in prison. Gerald and his parents appealed the case, and it eventually reached the U.S. Supreme Court. The Supreme Court's ruling on the Galt case brought about some far-reaching changes in the juvenile justice system. For the first time, juveniles were given certain constitutional rights that up to now had applied only to adults in criminal court. Juveniles now have the right to receive notice of the charges against them. They have the right to a lawyer or a public defender. They have the right to all of the due process safeguards given to adults. Other court decisions since the Galt case have extended the rights of juveniles even further. The legislatures, as well as the courts, have been working to improve the juvenile justice system. In the late 1960s, a series of broad reforms led Congress to pass the Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention Act in 1974. This act created the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention as part of the Department of Justice. The primary goals of the federal legislation were to divert status offenders and first-time offenders from the juvenile justice system, and to encourage the development of alternatives to locked, isolated juvenile institutions. Many people believe that community-based alternatives, such as foster homes, day treatment centers, community residential centers, and group homes, better serve the needs of juveniles. In the 1960s and 70s, advocates of these alternatives felt that juvenile institutions were too much like prisons, with mandatory uniforms, short haircuts, silent marches, and corporal punishment. The system underwent a series of reforms designed to create a more relaxed, supportive environment, but those changes met with opposition from many people. Many of the juveniles who had been placed in those institutions were transferred to smaller, private, or community-based facilities.
We've seen many changes over the past 40 years on how we treat the children in our care. 40 years ago, it was not uncommon for children to receive less than the normal amount of food. 40 years ago, the teachers being placed inside of our institutions were often those teachers that could not find a job in the public schools. Either they were not qualified or they were not sufficiently trained to do the job. Luckily, that has changed. And finally, in our lockup policies and procedures, 40 years ago was not uncommon for children to be placed in solitary confinement for not hours as it is today, but for days and weeks and even longer. Luckily, that also has changed.
Those institutions that remain in operation are working hard to raise their level of service and quality of care. The American Correctional Association is one of the driving forces behind that improvement. In the 1970s, ACA developed a set of standards for juvenile institutions. Other organizations, such as the American Bar Association, the National Advisory Committee, and the National Task Force, also developed standards. Unlike the other organizations, ACA developed a process of accreditation to measure compliance with its standards of service. Since that time, hundreds of facilities and agencies have become involved in the accreditation program.
I first began working with juveniles in 1974. And things have changed a lot since then, especially since the 1980s when the first standards were published for juvenile facilities. They radically changed the way institutions run. They established minimum guidelines and minimum standards that facilities should follow, and they deal with everything from training to security to administration to volunteers and security and food service. So it revolutionized us, and while we were running good programs in 1970 and 1975, the standards forced everybody to update their programs, so then we are working with modern programs and not operating in old modalities.
The reforms of the 1960s and 70s had a lasting effect on the juvenile justice system. The 1980s and 90s, however, have created new problems in juvenile justice. Juveniles often use and sell illegal drugs. They engage in more violent activities, and some of them belong to gangs. They tend to have less emotional support from families and relatives. They have little or no experience with the values of traditional American society. Many Americans have begun to feel that these delinquents need strict control rather than more freedom. The pendulum has begun to swing back from treatment to punishment. Drastic cuts in government funding have forced many community-based treatment programs to close, while boot camps for adjudicated juveniles are increasing in popularity. Some juvenile facilities have begun to place a renewed emphasis on custody rather than treatment. In some states, more juveniles accused of certain crimes are now required to stand trial in adult criminal court. Although we have come a long way, we still find institutions and programs that are overcrowded, and instances when juveniles are not given proper care or treated with dignity. But even if the pendulum has begun to swing back, it is unlikely to swing all the way back.
Most of the facilities in the United States, that after the kid is there 2 or 3 days, all the staff know him by their first name. You'll see staff putting their arm around some of the kids, talking to them. You'll see a lot of closeness.
Juveniles also have a tendency to trust people, even though some of them have had some very, very, very hard times and have a defiant outlook. They tend to trust people more than adults do. These are all attributes that juveniles in corrections have, which the people that are serving them can use to assist them in becoming better people.
Never again will our society consider it reasonable to treat juveniles as we did just a few hundred years ago. We now recognize that a fair and caring attitude, coupled with discipline and attention to public safety and responsibility, must guide our treatment of all juvenile offenders. Despite the ups and downs of history, America has, on the whole, become a more compassionate place, and that compassion will make an important difference in the lives of the young people who represent our future.